Hello. Thank you all for being here. I'm Kathleen Blackburn. I teach creative nonfiction here in the program for creative writing. I'd like to welcome you all. We're grateful this afternoon to Kate Kestnbaum for making the Kestnbaum Writer in Residence series possible. Also, enormous thanks to the faculty planning committee that helped to put this festival together, and to Starsha Gill for coordinating the events this week. I have the honor of introducing Daisy Hernandez, whose most recent nonfiction book, The Kissing Bug, a true story of a family, an insect, and a nation's neglect of a deadly disease, has taken the literary world by storm. The book documents Daisy's search to understand Chagas, an infectious disease caused by a parasite that is transmitted to animals and people by an insect called the kissing bug. Her quest began unwittingly in the 1980s when Daisy was a child and her aunt, Teodora, came from Colombia to live with Daisy's family in New Jersey. Teodora was sick with the kissing bug disease. At the time, Daisy and her family believed, like many people, that the disease was rare and only affected individuals living in South and Central America. What they didn't know was that an estimated 300,000 people in the Latinx community here in the United States have Chagas. A lack of information and fear of being shunned perpetuated silence around Chagas, even as Daisy's family cared for Teodora. Daisy writes, "The women in my family decided to save Teodora, but that is not how they told the story later." After her aunt's death from Chagas, however, Daisy did decide to tell that story. That choice led her beyond her family's history into a rigorous and at times wrenching investigation into the reasons why so few people know about this disease. She conducted interviews with more than 80 patients, doctors, and experts to reveal the sweeping history and impact of Chagas and to address the racial disparities of our healthcare systems, education, and policies. This book, The Kissing Bug, is often celebrated as a blend of personal narrative and investigative reportage. Daisy Hernandez was hailed in the Washington Post for expertly skating the line between memoir and science. Her book was applauded in BuzzFeed as a trenchant work of investigative journalism, weaving in cultural and political analysis, extensive research, and personal history. Any writer working at this kind of fusion will tell you that integrating research while propelling the narrative forward and maintaining a consistent, compelling voice is nothing short of daunting. Yet Daisy does this so seamlessly. I have started to think of The Kissing Bug not so much as a synthesis, as a restoration, a project that has drawn together the fragments of a whole. Indeed, The Kissing Bug highlights the risks of defining a problem too narrowly. It asks us to consider who gets left out when we isolate a disease only as a matter of science or of history or of personal experience. The genius here is that Daisy Hernandez brings together the threads of one narrative, and in so doing examines the policies and systemic inequities that fragmented the story into disparate parts in the first place. The Kissing Bug is the first book about Chagas for a public readership. It has won the 2022 Penn Gene Stein Book Award and was selected as an inaugural title for the National Book Foundation's Science and Literature program. Daisy Hernandez is also the author of the acclaimed memoir, A Cup of Water Under My Bed, and co-edited the classic feminist anthology, Colonize This: Young Women of Color on Today's Feminism. Her essays and fiction have appeared in numerous publications, ranging from the Bellingham Review, Fourth Genre, and The Rumpus, to reportage in National Geographic, The Atlantic, The New York Times, and Slate. And her writing has been aired on NPR's All Things Considered. Her magazine feature on transgender issues and communities of color was nominated for a GLAAD Media Award. She has also been a featured guest on NPR's Fresh Air. And she is right up the road as an associate professor of creative writing at Northwestern University. Please welcome Daisy Hernandez.
Oh my goodness, it's such a pleasure to have a writer describe your work. Thank you so much. That was really beautiful. And I want to give a special thank you to Starsha, who's been organizing us. Can we give her a round of applause? Yes. There's a lot that goes into making events like this happen, so special thank you. And Kathleen, I loved how you contextualized the book, so I feel like I can just jump in and start reading, but thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. With a book like this, it's always a little tricky about what excerpt to pick because there is the journalism part and there's research and so forth, but I'm going to read from the beginning because, I don't know, that just felt right today, so that's where I'm starting. In the 70s, Colombia's civil war remained tucked away in the mountains. Airplanes flew from Bogota without exploding in the sky, and no one worried about being kidnapped for hefty ransoms. At the Palace of Justice, the Supreme Court judges, staffers, and cafeteria workers did not think of dying at the hands of the military or the rebels. All of that came later. Tia Dora grew up with her parents, my grandparents, in Quiroga, a neighborhood on the south end of Bogota. The houses looked like multicolored boxes stacked in the corner of a room, and the sidewalks curved towards stores that sold arepas, buñuelos, and glass bottles of Coca-Cola. The hills rose beyond the roofs, high and sepia-tinged, sprouting one-room homes constructed of wood and tar paper, creating at times the impression that poor families were building in the direction of heaven. My abuelos from the town of Rameriquí, a few hours outside the capital, would probably have been in the hills if it had not been for a government program that granted them a home in the city. The family house had a front yard with 2 banana trees. A window in the living room looked out onto South 33rd Street. And Tia Dora and my mother and their brothers and sisters, there were a family of 11 children. They filled that living room over the years with gossip and a radio that played vallenato songs. The house had 3 bedrooms that accommodated itself to the size of the family. Beds were shared, pillows christened communal. Occasionally, another family rented a room so my grandparents, once farmers and now city folks without jobs, could earn extra cash. Beyond the main house, rooms were built for 2 of my uncles and their wives and young children. The hens had their coop in the backyard where they huddled in the cold and laid their generous eggs, and at night surely dreamt of the campo. The youngest of the girls, Tia Dora, grew up on a merry-go-round of women's hands, of sisters, cousins, comadres, and cuñadas, and maybe for that reason, she spent years referring to one of her oldest sisters as Mama. Or perhaps Tia Dora knew the truth, knew exactly who her mother was, but loved her doting sister so much that she could think of no higher compliment than Mama. As a child, she watched her older sisters make melcocha, a kind of molasses taffy. They heated the molasses, then waited for it to cool enough so they could pick it up and twist the melcocha into figure 8s on the table, cut it into pieces, and hand it out to friends, primos, neighbors, whoever happened to walk by the front door. Tia Dora had a predisposition toward joy. Her father's drinking did not bother her. She poured the cheap liquor down the drain and never blamed him. The sound of a brother coming home drunk at night and yelling at his wife pinched her ears, but men were men. They swung at each other and drank too much, and still there they were. Or maybe my auntie could afford to be generous, since that she planned to have a different future. By her late 20s, she was teaching elementary school children in the mornings and in the evenings working towards her bachelor's degree. She paid for the classes from her earnings, and she planned to be la primera, the first girl in the family to graduate from college. She carried herself as if she were made from copper, as if she was important, necessary even. One year, she saved her money to buy knee-high boots and Jackie O-style sunglasses. She gossiped with her cuñadas and the nieces about men's faces. Me encantan los hombres con bigotes, she'd say, because she thought facial hair on a man delightful. Though by all counts, she had no boyfriend. The first time that I met Tia Dora, I was 8 months old. My mother had been living in New Jersey 6 years by then, having left Colombia for work in the textile factories that dotted the towns along the Hudson River. She had been in the States long enough to marry a skinny Cuban exile, procure a green card, and give birth to me. She bundled me in a pink winter onesie, and we flew together from New York City to Bogota, where Tia and the other aunties cradled me and changed my diaper and fed me formula. They had a crib ready for me too, and over it they hung an enormous handmade doll with an obedient face and long braids the color of canela. The second time we visited Colombia, I had acquired language. I was 3. It was the summer of 1978, and Mommy and I arrived in Bogota to find Tia Dora embracing the fashion of the women's movement. She had cut her long, wavy hair into a bob and wore blazers, a scarf around her neck. She looked like a woman who expected to work on Wall Street. Her handbag, thin and boxy, suggested a briefcase. If the family stories are true, Tia Dora sat with me and the aunties one day, all of them chattering and laughing, and she decided to humor the older women, her sisters and cuñadas. In Spanish, she whispered to me, "Say puta." I must have given her a dubious look. The word felt new to my ears, but she insisted. "Puta," I cried to my mother and the aunties married to my uncles. My mouth latched onto the word, "Puta, puta, puta." The word felt good and hard, like carrying a knife between my teeth. The women screamed in mock horror, then howled with laughter. I had called everyone in the room a whore. If Thea were alive to read this, she would insist she never taught me vulgarities. "No fue así," she would chide. "Fue una broma, you're making it sound so serious, so it was funny." But I was 3 years old and already negotiating with my auntie's ideas about language and transgression. Tia Dora's sickness began with a swelling. Around 1979, her belly inflated under the blouses that she wore to teach at the local elementary school. She thought she was bloated, so she drank her mother's herbal teas. Nada. The discomfort persisted for a day, then another. Her belly stretched. In the shower, she would have looked down and seen it, her growing abdomen. Her brothers teased. They knew women who got knocked up. "Tell us, who's the father?" Tia Dora scowled, then laughed. She was not pregnant. She had barely kissed a man. She waved her brothers away. After another day or so, she ran a fever. The ice cubes melted on her forehead and the towels grew moist, soaking the heat from her body. At the hospital in Bogota, La Clínica Fray Bartolomé de las Casas, the nurse handed Tia Dora a baby blue nightgown with a pattern of stars. A pain must have torn through her body. Tia turned to her sister and begged, "Pray the rosary for me." The nurses looked at my auntie's belly. It was not the first time they had seen a woman pregnant and young, unmarried, and terrified. They told Tia's sister that it was most likely an embarazo ectópico, the baby growing in her fallopian tubes. In the hospital room, Tia Dora lay in bed and her sister paid 30 pesos to have a rollaway brought in so she could stay for the night. They recited the rosary together. "Bendito es el fruto de tu vientre. Blessed is the fruit of your womb." Then Tia Dora felt a chill. "Tengo frío," she said to her sister. "Give me my coat." She pointed at an empty chair. Her sister prayed harder. It was one thing to have a fever and another to lose your mind. The gloved hands wheeled Tia Dora into an operating room. She might have kept her eyes open and watched the light above the nurse's face, the honey-tinted halo. She would have heard the instruments tinkling on the tray, the unwanted music of paper rustling, latex gloves snapping into place, the hum of orders being issued. She could not have heard the blade, its silver face pressing into her belly. After the exploratory surgery, the doctors told her sister, Tiene los intestinos de 10 personas. My auntie's large intestine had dilated, widened, begun to go loose inside her body. She had enough of a large intestine for 10 people. The doctors offered her a colostomy bag. It would get her through her last year of college. And when she graduated, a colostomy bag did hang from the side of her belly. The doctors believed she might live a year, maybe 2. No one suspected a parasite. The women in my family decided to save Teodora. That is not how they told the story later. They credited the men, one particular doctor and also the husband of an auntie who knew of a clinic in Manhattan for poor people. But it is clear that my mother and my aunties made a decision. Teodora would not die. They shipped colostomy bags to Colombia. They paid for her flight to the United States in the winter of 1980. They asked my father if he would be so kind as to pick up Teodora at JFK. In the car that night on the way to the airport, my father's skinny fingers gripped the steering wheel. A Cuban, he had curly hair and bushy eyebrows, and he wore a flannel button-down shirt under a thin jacket. He was a man who refused winter. Now he was also irritated, tense, short-tempered, probably because he felt nervous, even afraid. Driving made him uncomfortable. The responsibility frustrated him. My mother sat next to him, a rag doll of a woman, and like a muñeca, she was consistent and quiet. Papi, a jack-in-the-box, grumbled about the traffic and why we had not left earlier, and did mommy have money for the tolls? But like a doll, my mother was steady in her moods, her half-smile, her non-judgment. She answered his questions and looked out the window at the black road ahead of her. I was 5 years old and my mother had stuffed me into a coat so heavy and snowball resistant that my arms could only move up and down. The mittens on my hands were puffy as pillows, but I was enjoying having the back seat to myself. My sister Liliana had stayed home with someone. She was still new, only 4 months old, and I did not quite understand that she was a permanent addition to our family. The world had always been as it was in that moment in the car, the rag doll and the jack-in-the-box and me. I was the only one thrilled about the drive. I loved airports. I loved the balloons people brought for those who arrived and the flowers too. I loved running around the grown-ups, squeezing between their bodies. I loved how people hollered the names of sisters and cousins and how they cried and hugged. Every arrival was a premio, a prize someone deserved. My mother hated the airport. 2 years earlier, on our way back from Colombia, agents at JFK had opened our bags. The men picked through my mother's panties and socks. They tasted the arequipe and the hard candies too. Later, she complained to her sister, hasta los pañales. Even the diapers were suspect. At the airport that night, my mother worried that the immigration men would not let Teodora through. And so while I ran around the waiting area, Mommy stood with my father and all the women and men, everyone in winter coats and heavy scarves, and monitored the doors and tried not to think of the worst. My mother watched sisters and abuelas and couples arrive, but no Teodora. Maybe they had detained her. Maybe she had gotten sick during the flight. Maybe they had simply refused her entry. The crowd thinned. My father grew irritable. Where was she? He still had to drive us all the way back home, and it was the middle of December, and the roads just awful. The doors opened again. Teodora took a tentative step out, and the corners of my mother's lips collapsed. Her sister's face had thinned. How much weight had she lost? Already she looked like a young woman about to die. In the back seat of the car, Tia and I studied each other. I did not have my mother's worry. I did not know that grown women could become sick and die. If anyone had asked, I would have said my auntie looked like all the grown women I knew, except that she was flaca. Also, someone in Colombia had stuffed her into a ruana and coat. I sensed a kindred spirit, an auntie who did not get to dress herself, an auntie who was coming to live in our apartment in Union City, New Jersey. And I'll stop there. Thank you for listening.
That was great. Thank you, Daisy. There's a section of the book where you write about how in science classes when we were kids, we learned that all pathogens are created equal, that they don't care about citizenship, that they aren't racist. This is what we're taught. And that when we get sick, it's a failure of our own diligence. And so when you were reading, I was thinking about that framing and how you offer in this book a counter-narrative. And you, in which you think about how infectious diseases don't necessarily get eradicated by our public health programs, but as you put it, they get contained to communities of color, the poor, the unhoused, and countries south of the United States. Could you talk to us a little bit more about that systemic process and how you're kind of thinking through that in this book?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that part of working on this book, and we were talking about this earlier with the students, you know, sometimes people think when they're writing nonfiction, I think one of the students said, you know, you have all the facts in front of you, but that's not what we're doing as nonfiction writers. We're asking questions about those facts. And so I did have to reckon with my own education around public health. And part of that was realizing, oh no, I've been taught that like, yeah, I think I write, you know, they don't care about our tax returns. They don't care about the zip codes in which we live and so forth. That's what we're taught, that they will defy all of that. But as I was researching this, you know, it becomes more and more clear that, yeah, it does matter where you live. And it does matter what kind of job you have and your fluency to language and so forth. And I sort of still early in my process of working on this book, we had the Zika virus. If folks remember that, like 2016, that ballpark. And my parents live in South Florida, and it was amazing to suddenly see people, you know, who had the money and were pregnant, could leave South Florida and go live with family or go stay in other parts of the country where they felt they would be safer. And so just at this very basic level, right, you could see the incredible disparities in healthcare access. And those are the aspects of healthcare that don't get documented, right? Like how many people like left South Florida while they were pregnant, you know, to keep themselves and their babies safe, and who had to stay behind and reckon with this. Part of what I also had to, yeah, I feel like I could have called, like a subtitle for this book could have been like the undoing of like my education around public health, because part of it was also I'm the generation that grew up learning about AIDS, you know, in the classroom and being taught about the epidemic there, and what got communicated to me, and I was very fortunate about like where I went to school, go progressive Catholic schools out in Jersey, shout out, this is my shout out to the progressive Catholic teachers out there, because I feel like we were really taught that the goal was eradication, right? That we were gonna like defeat this, and there was like all these problems with this kind of war analogy, but so when I started working on this, it's like, yeah, why is this a neglected disease? Like, why do we ignore this? Is it just this simple, like, oh, this affects poor people and so forth? And yeah, why is the goal not eradication? And part of what I had to come to conclusion was exactly what you described, which is that it's not only Chagas disease. If we look at tuberculosis, a lot of us think of tuberculosis as something that has been eradicated and we don't, you know, worry about it when we go to work and so forth. But we did not eradicate it around the world. And so in the US, you are gonna, you know, find it in immigrant communities, in unhoused communities, anyone who's had to live in group settings, who's been more exposed to TB. And so I realized, you know, we don't have, that's not the only disease, but we don't actually have a policy of eradication. We're containing it, you know, and I think that, you know, we'll see what ends up happening with COVID, but you know, I think the same kind of thing can happen where it's sort of like, okay, it's going to stay in this in these more vulnerable communities. We don't have to worry about it over here. So when I came across Dr. Paul Farmer, do folks know Dr. Paul Farmer's work? A great medical anthropologist. Yes, and so he, you know, in a biography of him, he talked, so he was a doctor who dedicated his life to working in Haiti and delivering medical care in Haiti, and also worked on TB. You know, just did incredible work around the world, especially around TB actually as well. But he talked about, you know, there's the great epidemiological divide, where some people, some of us are going to die, you know, you know, old age and everything that comes with that and so forth, but we have access to healthcare. And then there are people who are dying because, you know, they can't get aspirin, you know, they can't get just very basic, they can't get an x-ray to see what the diagnosis would be, right? And so that great epi divide really, like when I read that, it clarified so much. I think because as a child of immigrants, I think children of immigrants have like a special relationship to maps, you know, and to like land. It's, you know, how we think about land. And so when he said that sort of great epi divide, I could just really see this like line drawn on the ground of like, yeah, some people are here and here. And even for those of us, so I think of us, everyone in this room is to some degree, we're part of the epidemiological elite, as I write in the book, except that periodically you realize, oh, there's another elite above you, right? So I remember working on this book and discovering, you know, people can have boutique doctors where they basically have doctors on call. And if you have an extra 80 grand a year, you know, you can do that. Oh, we're not so the epi elite. And I'm sure there's more epi elite beyond that. But we've structured our healthcare in this country in such a way that that's how it goes right now, but not forever.
Mm-hmm. I wondered how long our conversation would go before we ran like headlong into talking about COVID, but I want to maybe put it off for one more question, because something else that I think that, you know, that what you're talking about brought to mind was the way that Theodora did not want to talk about having Chagas, in part because of how she saw the American response to AIDS and people who had AIDS, and also in part to her recognizing her own situational vulnerability as an immigrant. And yeah, I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about that, and just the complexity of dealing with kind of recognizing in her own way the way that the containment that you're talking about brings with it a stigma. And she was aware of that to some extent.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, it takes me back again to that wonderful question earlier today about like we have all the facts and how are we writing about them, because it was only when I began to write that I realized, like I knew this about my auntie, like I had kept her silence, like we never spoke about it with anyone outside of our family, that she had been diagnosed with Chagas disease or the kissing bug disease. And I knew that and understood that. I'm not sure that I was ever sat down explicitly to be told, but like we knew that. But it was only in the writing process that I realized, oh, I agreed to that silence. I never questioned that silence. And Theodora and I had a very contentious relationship. So, you know, I write about her in this like, you know, very sympathetic way. She was somebody who didn't speak to me for 7 years after I came out to my family as queer. She completely struggled with her own homophobia. She was totally like the upward mobile immigrant who was like nothing transgressive, you know. So we end up having a very intense like love-hate relationship, or somebody said, oh, toxic, you know. I was like, all right, that's the new language. We used to just say like love, hate, and you know, that kind of thing. But toxic, maybe, I don't know. It's a big word, but I guess it's accurate. But it was only in writing that I realized like, oh, we argued about so much, right? We argued about my sexuality. We argued about politics as I became. We argued about basic things when I was little, like how I was going to wear my hair and like how I talked in the family. I mean, we argued about so much, but we never argued about her disease. Like we never argued about the illness and about who knew. It was like I had learned at such a young age. And as you were saying earlier, I was translating for her at a young age when nurses were actually coming to the home at certain points to check in and on her after she had multiple abdominal surgeries. And so, I learned in that process to keep that silence. And so much that, like, it's like decades later, and only when I'm writing it am I realizing, like, we never argued. This is like the one topic we never argued about. And I think I understood early on, just from being otherized as a Latina in a predominantly white community, was that like I was also protective of her, and I understood the stigma of like, I think I understood it to some degree initially, probably around race and ethnicity, because my parents were, you know, very much, I was the kid who was growing up in a white English-only neighborhood who was hearing all the people say nasty things about my parents in English, right? Because they felt like they could say these things about my parents and that like somehow the kid doesn't hear you. So like, you know, it's, which like now I look back and I'm like, you knew I understood. Like, that doesn't make any sense, you jerks. But I was sort of growing up in that context. And so I think I understood otherizing. And I also grew up as you were saying, you know, I think she herself was probably influenced by the AIDS epidemic, but I know that I was, because I was growing up in a time period where I still remember Ryan White, who was a little child who adults did not want him to be in school because he had hemophilia and he had contracted HIV, and they did not want him in the school. And I still like remember the images of these like white grown-ups like yelling and screaming at this little child. So I think I knew at a young age, like, okay, we have to protect, you know? So I think it was like this kind of confluence around race and health, you know, a huge health crisis for the country that kind of came together and taught me a certain kind of silence. And then you become a writer.
Break the silence. So let's talk about COVID for a minute. I mean, this book was published in 2021. A little bit prior to our conversation this afternoon, you told me that it was actually originally scheduled to be published in 2020, and then they got pushed. This was before anyone knew what was going to happen in 2020. It got pushed for, you know, reasons unrelated to a public health crisis. But you know, I am curious, you know, what was it like to finish a book about the racial disparities of our healthcare system, you know, in the midst of something like the pandemic? And how would you describe, you know, here we are in 2023, the relationship of conversations around this book and around COVID? What has that been like?
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting because whenever you work on a nonfiction project, I think any nonfiction book, it's like constant ethical questions. It's like a little train of ethical questions. And then when it's around medicine and science, even more, it's like just adds onto it. And so my editor and I did have a lot of ethical questions about how to write about COVID, how much, how little, does it need to be a new chapter? Does it need to be half the book set? Like what, you know, we were in it. This is like in March, we're like fact checking and all of a sudden this is happening because the book was ready for quite some time before it was published in 21. But, and we finally decided that it was, you know, going to be a section, not like half the book and not even a whole chapter. And part of that was, again, so many ethical questions, and part of it, as I think I told you earlier, was we were so intensely immersed in everything about COVID, right? Morning, noon, night, middle of the night, all the time. Like, come on, you know, you were online reading, right? Or trying to avoid reading. And I felt like, I don't know that I have anything new at that point to add to the conversation, right? So like, the sort of like a really, you kind of have to have that really heart-to-heart with yourself and also your editor of like, what do I have to say that's new, but I need to acknowledge it. And I think what was happening in life, the facts, was that I was really just stunned to see how much was happening with COVID in those first months that I had seen with Chagas, in the sense that with Chagas disease, at that time, and I would say this is still true, but in different ways, it's really hard to get tested. It was, you know, it's like, and especially for Latinx migrant communities, they don't necessarily easily have a primary care doctor. Even if they do, I can tell you that for myself, I asked to be tested for Chagas, and I had to go to my primary care doctor with like a little printout about Chagas disease, and she had to say, hold tight, I'm gonna call infectious diseases and talk with them, and then I had to wait for that, and then I had to finally, you know, so this is like 3 appointments later or whatever, and I got like a nice professorship job where I can like make that happen, you know, but you know, if you're working, cleaning someone's home, you don't have like 3 different days for like doctor's appointments and lab work and all of this. So I was just seeing the disparity, just how hard it was to get tested for Chagas. And then when COVID hit, you might remember that, you know, it was easy to get tested. The ease was dependent on your neighborhood and what zip code you were living in. And there were entire communities with disproportionately Black and brown where it was not easy to get tested. And the same thing happened on the other end with the vaccine. Can I just tell you a vaccine story? I totally need to tell you this, especially for the writers in the room. So I could not get my parents are in their 80s, I could not get them a vaccine appointment in South Florida, right? They are not online, they are like, just not, my mother looks at her smartphone like, what are you, you know? So I'm like trying to make appointments, all the appointments are taken at Walmart, at Walgreens, wherever it was. And I finally got so frustrated that I went on social media just to share my frustration. I was like, I can't get my parents tested. I do not, and my parents live in a 100% Cuban community, like very working class. Like I was like, I am just full of old people. I'm just having a hard time imagining that all these folks got digital appointment, like, you know, because you needed to go online and make these appointments. So I went on social media, I complained about it, just like, wah. And somebody direct messaged me. She was like, get in touch with me. My sister works for the National Guard. We can get your parents in. And I was like, who are you? Because I don't know you. And she writes back and she's like, I read your first book, A Cup of Water Under My Bed. I loved your book. It spoke to me so much. My sister can hook you up. That's how my parents got vaccinated, because of my book, okay?
Wow.
So if you think, writers out there, if you think it doesn't translate into tangible effects later on, it does. But then when I went to write in the book, it was about COVID. It was actually, I think my editor and I were both a little taken aback how, just in terms of the writing, it felt very seamless, you know, because it's like, it's racial disparities, and like COVID, yes, like unfortunately, like it fit right into the narrative that I had already been writing for years. Yeah.
In part of the book, you expand to include other families. It's actually, you know, the section is called In Search of Other Families in the Latinx community, particularly here in the U.S., who are disproportionately impacted by Chagas disease and also by other factors that make accessibility to healthcare quite challenging and to information around Chagas difficult. And those stories in that section, I mean, the whole book is great, but those stories are some of the most riveting parts of the book. And I found myself, like, particularly wrecked by the story of Carlos, and I was thinking about why that was. And I think maybe part of it is because in this particular case, this is a man that had been infected with Chagas and lived with it for over 3 decades, and had been identified for a heart transplant and received one, and survived. And it was like this example of maybe like what could be if we had a sort of structural change, you know. Anyway, I was just, you know, for members of the audience who haven't gotten to that part of the book yet, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about interviewing these families, you know, not unlike your grandparents who are living in these communities, and how that work ended up being a part of the narrative.
Yeah, that was actually where the book began, was we lost my auntie to this disease after living with it for many years, and I realized, like, I've never met another family who has navigated this. And I think we said it's a parasitic disease, but for those who, you know, I don't know, I feel like I need to put on my, like, little science hat and say why it disproportionately affects Latin migrants, Latinx migrants in the U.S. is it's a parasitic disease that gets transmitted to you by contact with a triatomine insect called the kissing bug, which is actually on the cover of the book, which is kind of cool how they did that. And those insects are actually found in South America, Central America, and Mexico. They're also found in the United States, all over California, the Southwest, the southern part of the U.S., Florida, Louisiana, you know, all that. But for a bunch of different reasons, we don't have transmission rates in the same way here in the U.S. that we have in South America. And the parasite generally affects the heart. It'll also affect the GI system like it did for my auntie, but it goes through the hollow organs. That's like what it goes for. Charles Darwin found these insects. You know, when he was traveling to South America, there's been speculation that he had Chagas disease, but there's also been speculation that Charles Darwin had like 40 different diseases, so I can't put a lot of stock in that. You know, it's actually where the book became the last part of the book. I didn't really, you know, what's great about, I don't know if this is true for other writers, but for myself, I don't think too far out with any project. You know, I just think about what the immediate question is. And I know I have at least one writer friend who, she is just so much smarter. Like, she really thinks through what's going to be the emotional impact on me of doing this kind of project. And she really thinks about it long term, you know? So she's like, you know, I suggested to her that she like write about her mother and her mother's passing and grief and like just an enormous relationship that they had. And she's like, oh no, I'm not spending the next 5 years writing about, you know, my dead mother, like And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. I should have thought about that, you know, because all I could think of was just, I want to hear the stories of other families and I want to elevate those stories and do some news article. You know, I was thinking magazine pieces. I didn't think through like, oh, I am basically now going to speak to a lot of my tiadora, like a lot of tiadoras, you know, in the world, which is exactly what happened, Carlos included, because these interviews were not just a one-time sit-down. There were multiple interviews that happened over the span of several years. And some people trusted me more with their stories than others. I think it definitely made a difference that I had a family member who had this disease, but it also made it difficult because patients always wanted to know how my tiadora was. Ooh. And so I always had to tell them, you know, that she had died. And then I found myself, you know, doing a lot of ethical questions. It was like nonstop. I don't know why we don't have like a guide to ethical questions in nonfiction, because there were so many questions, because I found myself with some interviews telling people, no, but she had a wonderful life, because she did have a wonderful life. Because the parasite will attack your heart, but it will be dormant in your body. It could be dormant up to 30 years where you have no symptoms. And not everyone develops symptoms. It's only like 1 in 3 people who goes on to have symptoms. So some people, the first person that they identified in Brazil, the disease was first identified in Brazil in 1909, reporters actually tracked down that woman who had been identified as having Chagas when she was a toddler. They found her, you know, decades later, and she was fine. And she died from other causes as far as we can tell. So, you know, part of the reason it's been neglected as well is the biology of the disease itself. So, so yeah, it was like interviewing people. So I did this whole like, you know, oh, but my auntie had an amazing life. Don't feel, you know, like trying to like suddenly manage how other people felt about their own. I mean, it was just insane, but I put myself in that situation as well. And there were a lot of tricky questions because, again, if I had only been as smart as my friend, but I didn't take into account that many people were in the same situation that my tiadora had been, where they had this disease, they had the diagnosis, but they actually knew very little about it. They knew that it was a parasite, but they knew very little about the science of it. So I sometimes found myself in that strange position of trying to decide how much do I share with them, you know, what do they want to know, what don't they want to know. I ended up in a hospital setting serving as an interpreter yet again, which I had not planned to do. But so many patients were, including Carlos, I think were so generous with their time because they had not known a lot about their disease. Like, he went for decades without knowing what he was a teenager. He started collapsing, you know, because his heart was giving out. You know, he had his first pacemaker when he was very young. And he actually thought, when he was starting to get like fatigued, and it was like, you know, causing depression, and he was like, you know, he was all changing just when he was a teenager, and he actually thought, oh, this is what it's like to grow up, you know, and be a teenager. You get depressed and like moody and so forth. But then he collapsed, and even with the collapse, he was able to get up, and they were like, well, that's weird, you know. But again, this is in Central America. You don't. You know, it's like my parents' generation. You go to the doctor when there's an emergency, like you're about to maybe die. But other than that, you don't deal with doctors, right? Because there's such a fear, you know, of doctors and of what they can mean, and the experts and the authority figures. And in his case, also just access, you know, in rural Central America. And so it actually took some time before he was able to get his first pacemaker, then his second one, but he had known so little about what had happened. So I think that also motivated him. And there's a mom in the book, because the other way that the disease can be transmitted, besides direct contact with the insect, is through pregnancy. So if you're a woman who has Chagas disease, there's a risk, like Zika virus, that during pregnancy it can pass on to your baby. And she had not known that, even though she grew up in a community where people actually really knew about this disease. She had her dad has Chagas disease, her sister had it. She thought, similar to, I had no idea that there was anything called congenital Chagas disease. And she thought it was like an old person's disease because that's when the symptoms come up. And she was very clear with me, like, I don't want another mother to have to go through her baby in the NICU for months and not knowing for weeks and weeks. She was the one that actually told her doctors, could this be Chagas disease? Because they were checking for like every other, you know, newborn disease that it could be, because the symptoms are just very, ambiguous, right? There aren't like, there isn't a clear defining symptom with a newborn. So they were incredible. The patients were incredibly generous.
Thank you for that. In a moment, I want to open up to the questions from the audience, but I want to go back to a little bit of what you were talking about with the science of the insect and the parasite. You know, the theme of our literary festival this week is art and trouble, and you know, the writing in this book focuses on, as you say, a parasitic disease borne by an insect. But you don't like bugs, and you write that you think that they're gross, and for good reason. You are afraid of the kissing bug, and yet you found yourself in the rough alongside scientists hunting them. You watched as one researcher used the heat from his body to bait one. You held them up close in a jar. And so I'm just wondering about, you know, if you could talk about the role of writing toward the thing that, you know, troubles you, and the thing that like you resist, the role of resistance in writing when that thing that terrifies is like right at the center of the story.
Yeah, insects trouble me. I am not that person that like runs towards the insects. Anybody else afraid of insects, or are you that who's afraid of bugs? Okay, only a few of us willing to raise our hands. Okay, I know the rest of you are scared of them as well. Yeah, no, actually, I was so troubled and terrified that when I started first reading science journal articles about these insects, they'll include images, drawings, etc. I would manipulate, I would move the PDF so that the images were off screen, so that I only had to read the text. Or at one time, I would also like print out a PDF, and then I would get a Post-it note to cover the image, because so it wasn't just like, oh, she's a little scared of them. It's like, no, I cannot see images of them. I was so terrified. And I think like what helped me, you know, the reason that I continued on was you know, just the like, I needed to know why this was so neglected. I needed to know what families had gone through. And so someone said to me like, oh, you're so fearless. I'm like, I am the most fearful person in the room. The difference is just like, I'm not going to let it get in my way. So like, it's just gonna, the fear is just gonna sit there with me as like we're walking through this. And I just like figure it out, like Post-it notes, off screen, you know, like you can figure out how to negotiate with your fear all sorts of crazy ways. And I did that, and it took me a while to but like I said, I needed to know what other families were going through. I also didn't realize at first that I was going to be writing a book, so that really helps too. Like if you don't know exactly that you're writing, that you're going to spend the next 7 years working on this, that's really helpful. I thought I'm just going to write one article about it. I wrote a short story about Shaga's. I'm like, that's it, and then I needed to know more, and like, you know, this is the thing with like research, right? Like you learn a little bit more and you're like, what? You know, and then like learning that Charles Darwin had collected these insects, I'm like, what? I need to know more about that, you know? And every door like becomes like, right, opens into a room full of more questions and more questions. And it was a strange moment when I realized that I could tolerate looking at images of them. And yeah, actually what's great about, so I did end up at a laboratory looking at these insect colonies. I got a chance to see how the insects defecate. And you might be like, Daisy, why would you want to see how the insects defecate? Because that's actually how they pass the parasite to you. They don't do it through their mouth. It's not like mosquito bite kind of thing. And if you would have ever have told me that I could handle that in any way, I would have been like, oh, you're so crazy. But I did, and I think part of it was just, I don't know, I guess I'm not a therapist, but yeah, like cognitive behavioral therapy, like the slow exposure like method. I was doing that without realizing that I was slowly exposing myself to it. But I needed to know, and once it became clear that I was writing a book, I don't know, it's just sort of interesting that other part of my brain clicked in, like I need to be able to explain this to people who are so terrified that like they would never even be able to pick up a book that has a bug on the cover, right? I need to be able to explain it to them. And that definitely got me over the like, I don't know, not over it, but just kind of through it, I guess, the fear, yeah.
Terrific, that's great. Any questions? We have a few minutes for questions from the audience. I see kind of fill up a queue.
Yeah. Kathleen started the conversation, you know, mentioning how we're conditioned growing up to think of infectious diseases in a kind of apolitical way. And I mean, COVID didn't start this, but COVID pretty much cemented this idea. You know, there's the skepticism of medicine these days, or medical authorities, and then there's the, you know, you should believe in facts, you know, scientific facts, and it seems to kind of, you know, settle along political lines. So what would you say to someone now, not just a writer, but anyone, whether they're young or old, how do you maintain a productive or healthy skepticism of how you are taught science, or how you engage with you know, any health issue, or just science in general? I mean, what would you say to someone?
How to maintain a skeptic, or how to like even interact with science education.
Yeah, exactly. It's like how, yeah, I mean, to understand that there's more to it than just facts sometimes.
I think what was so fascinating to me about that first year of the pandemic was how willing we all were to suddenly read science article, right? And medical journal article. Like suddenly, right, we were becoming these like experts on science and medicine, and out of like sheer necessity. And I think the only difference is that when there's not a pandemic, we don't have that urgency, but it's not for a lack of ability, right? Like many of us, right? How many of you made like a little vocabulary list and like started Googling that, you know? Like we did a lot to teach ourselves, you know, and to ask hard questions. And to also like, you know, we supported journalists and scholars who were asking hard questions during that time too, because we followed them on social media and we shared their information, we shared their articles, right? So I think we have the amazing capacity to be much more educated and skeptical and asking really hard, good questions than we normally do. But like when there isn't quite the urgency, then, you know, we need to do laundry, you know, right? Like life interferes. But I think that actually your question made me think of just the larger political climate that we're living in, where just what elementary school teachers are going through now in terms of what they are able to teach in the classroom, and the just incredible, we're in a very intense political time. And so I think that, that's actually, I feel like, where the question is. And so, yeah, I don't know a solution other than run for the school board, everywhere, if you can. If that's in your wheelhouse, go for it, because we need people who are willing to give priority to public health and to the health care of all, as opposed to, just more harmful political views, yeah. Mm-hmm. I think there was a question in the back.
Yeah, I think there was a question there.
So can you talk about your experience talking or perhaps interviewing your family members to understand your tia Dora better, and to obviously be able to describe her better in your work?
Yeah, it's catch as catch can. Yeah, it's basically, hey, I'm gonna ask you a bunch of questions, put on the tape recorder, and the conversation is gonna meander in a million ways, and then 30 minutes later, you might hear something you can use, 40 minutes later, hey, you know what, a question about, did she have a boyfriend? What was up with that? It is, never, I would not go into your own family. I mean, people have done it. I just have not been able to do it with my family. So it might really, it does really depend on your family. But I have not done the approach of, I'm sitting here and we will now begin the interview. First question is it really is more like a conversation, or I start with oh, tell me about this. I usually do have a first question. And it does really depend on the family member, right? Not every family member wants to talk at length. And then a lot, I just remember, I'm laughing because I remember driving around Bogota with my uncle. I'm asking him questions and silently taking notes in my mind about some information, his perspective on the situation, little details that he was giving me that was confirming what others had told me. It's quite a process, at least my family. Every family is a little different, but it's quite a process. That said, I've also have interviewed a lot of strangers before I tried to interview my family. So I don't know what it's like if you're starting with your family first. Because I know what that process looks like with a stranger, and an expert and non-expert. It's so with my family, it's I let it more be that kind of conversation, and more organic. And then there are times when I would get on the telephone, not so much with my mom. My mom is the absolute worst. She can't remember anything. But I would, and then my auntie remembers too much, which means she's making it up a little bit, right? So it's very hard. So I'm I would ask my mom a question and then try kind of between them is the truth, So you have to take that into account. But sometimes I would call them with a pointed question of I don't want to say I knew she was coming to JFK, but it was Avianca. It must have been that airline. I don't even think that made it into that detail made it in, right? But sometimes I would call with specific questions. And they were, I think for them, but what I will say is that this has also happened for other friends of mine who write nonfiction and have interviewed family members, which is that it's because you have a relationship, when you're asking about trauma or about painful memories, it's a different kind of pacing than with a stranger, because you're involved in it too. And so sometimes you have to think about shorter interviews, carried out over time, as opposed to longer interviews that you might do with someone. You have to think about the fact that, it's causing them pain to also relive this, but with you, because they, again, it might just depend, are they trying to protect you? Are they trying to protect another family member from you? Yeah. So it's very different stakes, than it is when you're interviewing somebody who's not your own family. Yeah. Thanks, that's such a great question.
Yeah.
Katie.
So you read Spanish and English in your writing and your book. Is it hard, or was it hard to pick what words and dialogue would be in Spanish or in English?
No. Yeah, that's a great question. If it was hard to pick where I would switch into Spanish or English. In my early drafts, whenever it whenever it happens on its own, it gets in there. So then in the later drafts, I'm like, oh, does then I think about somebody who doesn't have any Spanish knowledge, and sort of how much do I need to put in, and then it really changes on the sentences. Like I tend to sometimes I like the direct translation. I have a friend who's completely annoyed every time I do that in my work. She's actually asked me, like, why do you do that? It annoys me that I put the direct translation. But sometimes I don't know, I like the árboles, trees. I don't know, sometimes I like the juxtaposition of the sounds, and so I do want to do that. But for this book, it was mostly rephrasing, when she said los hombres con bigotes, it's I didn't do a direct translation of that, but told the reader. But I kept it because it sounds so good in Spanish, So a lot of times you have to think about just, again, the sonics of it, right? When does it sound so good, or when, I don't know, when I always have ambivalent feelings about the word nada, and I kept it, but even when I was reading it today, I was like, I don't know. I feel like that word has gotten appropriated in a certain way sometimes. So I still have certain moments where I'm like, did I want to do that? But yeah, there's sort of moments where I decide sort of what the emotional resonance is of the piece. And then sometimes there's a short chapter after her death where I have to tackle the language issue head on, because to say that she's died sounds in English, to me, even now it sounds really hollow. But my auntie, when she dies, one of my aunties gets on. My auntie died unexpected. She was very, very sick, but it was still kind of unexpected in the moment. And so when we called family members in South America, my family member decided, another auntie did not say she's died. She said se nos fue, which literally is she's left us, which obviously can mean that someone has died, but can also mean se nos, suffice it to say, my uncle was very confused. Where has my sister gone? And it was it was this crushing moment of I had to pull the phone and say se murió, and that I had to write a whole chapter about that, because in Spanish that it was crushing to have that moment. So yeah, it's a lot of checking in with myself around, yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I was thinking about sort of when you were being introduced, how there was this contrast and melding of different genres, and I was thinking about the double meaning of political, whereas sometimes we say political as in controversial, and sometimes we say political as in something that's very personal to our beliefs. And I was thinking about how when you write something that is so personal to you, and I read briefly on your author's biography website that it made it onto Fox News or something, and this very personal experience, and then it becomes very politicized. How you sort of cope with both the positive reactions and the negative reactions, and something that can be very nuanced, becoming sort of flat and white. People who don't understand what it's really about.
Yeah, I think what really helps me is being in integrity with why I'm working on the project, because I can't control the outcomes. I can't control what readers are going to do with it. And so I also, did I hear you saying that what you wrote ended up on Fox?
No, what you wrote.
Oh yeah, what I wrote. Okay, yeah, I was gonna say, hey, I also ended up on Fox News. I ended up on Fox News, and so an entire side of my family is very right-wing and Republican and Trump supporters and so forth, and they were like, why are they upset with Daisy on Fox News? But I was I felt in integrity. It was a piece that I wrote many years ago, but I was in integrity with what I had written and what I had said, and so that carries you through, because I never in my mind thought that anyone would pick that piece up around my use of the word gringo, basically, which we can talk about afterwards if you want to know more about that. But yeah, I feel like you have to be in integrity, and especially with this book, because it is about disease and about a vulnerable community in the US. I had to keep coming back to I need this book to exist for other people like me who are in a family with this disease, and we need to have this information. We need to know about this. I need healthcare professionals to know more about it, to know the patient side of it a little bit more. So that has carried me through a lot of worries about what other people will do with it. And then I have to share this because it just happened last night. I think as writers, like we worry about the negative things that people can do with our books, but people can do amazing things with our books. So last night I was at the American Society of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene. They have their annual conference basically. And this like biology professor at Tulane read my book, and she has like gone into the community and started testing people for Chagas disease. And like she's given like the book to like the pastor at the local church, you know, where they're doing this testing, and like she's doing amazing stuff. So like people will take your book and do amazing things with it as well. Like it's not always, we don't always have to worry as, you know, alone. Like there's just amazing people out there.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thank you for your questions, Daisy. Thank you so much. This was wonderful.